You see, there's a kind of silence that screams louder than any words ever could. When someone with an avoidant attachment style pulls away, disappears, or starts acting cold, your instinct is to explain, fix, or chase. But let me tell you something powerful. The right message doesn't beg for connection, it commands reflection. Today, I'm going to show you one kind of text. Just one. That doesn't scream, "Come back," but instead plants a seed in their mind that grows in their absence. It doesn't say, "I miss you." It makes them wonder why they miss you. Because that's what haunts an avoidant. Not your needness, not your presence, but your power in silence, your clarity without chaos, your peace without their validation. Less is power. When you deal with someone who has an avoidant attachment style, every word you send them is measured not by its length, but by its emotional weight. And the more emotionally charged your message is, the more they retreat. They don't retreat because they don't care. They retreat because the intensity of connection threatens their internal sense of safety. That's their wiring. That's the battlefield you're on. And this is where most people make the mistake. They try to talk their way into clarity, into closeness, into understanding. But when you're dealing with an avoidant, the more you say, the more they shut down. That's why less is power. The moment you stop explaining yourself, the moment you stop pouring out paragraph after paragraph hoping to be heard, something shifts. You're no longer chasing validation. You're reclaiming your space. And trust me, that's when they notice. Because avoidants fear you leaving, they fear losing the emotional upper hand. They fear someone becoming so grounded, so centered, so calm in their own self-worth that they can no longer be controlled by distance. That's what scares them. Not your emotion, but your neutrality. So when you send a text that simply says, "I'm respecting your space," just know I've made peace with everything and I'm choosing peace moving forward. It hits differently. It's not dramatic. It's not begging. It's not angry. And yet it lands harder than any desperate plea ever could, because in those few words, you communicate everything that needs to be said. You say, "I'm no longer available for confusion." You say, "I see what's happening and I'm not here to fight it." You say, "I'm way never works. I'm not waiting around for you to figure me out. I've already figured myself out." That's the kind of message that lingers in the mind of an avoidant, because they're used to being chased. They're used to being the one who sets the pace. But now the script has flipped. Now you're the one setting the tone, and that tone is peace, not withdrawal, not passive aggression, not cold silence, calm, real calm, calm with self-respect. And that calm, that quiet certainty, that's what haunts them, because for the first time they can't read you. You're not playing the old emotional game anymore. You're not reaching out with emotion bleeding through every sentence. You're sending something neutral and yet powerfully final, and that confuses the avoidance protective system. It makes them look again, read it again, think again. They won't respond right away. They may not respond at all, but they'll feel it. Oh, they will feel it. Less is power. And when you finally understand that, you stop trying to convince them to value you and start showing them what value actually looks like. Quiet, clear, and unforgettable. Detachment triggers curiosity. When someone never works, when someone has an avoidant attachment style, they are hardwired to feel safest when there's emotional distance. It's not that they don't feel, it's that closeness overwhelms them. And the moment they sense emotional intensity or dependency, their instinct is to pull back, protect, and disconnect. That's why your silence, your calm, your stillness, it doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means everything is happening. It behind the scenes, in their mind, where they replay your behavior over and over trying to decode it. The second you stop chasing, the second you stop trying to fix it, you shift the entire dynamic. Because you're no longer giving them a predictable emotional pattern. You're no longer the person who reaches out after a few hours. You're no longer explaining your feelings, hoping they'll finally understand. And when that expected rhythm disappears, their brain can't ignore it. You see, avoiding never works. Avoiding used to people reacting. They're used to someone trying harder when they pull away. They know how that dance goes. But when you take a step back and don't follow the script, you create space. And in that space, a question is born. Why are not reacting? What changed? Have they moved on? Were they stronger than I thought? That one question becomes a quiet echo in their mind. You don't have to be mean. You don't have to post revenge quotes or make noise on social media. You don't even have to block them. In fact, what's more powerful is when you do nothing, when you let your absence speak for itself, when the last thing they see from you is grace, peace, and a sense of emotional maturity they never expected. Curiosity isn't created through force. It's created through contrast, and contrast is powerful. When you go from over-explaining to saying very little, from emotionally reacting to calmly detaching, it leaves a mark. It creates a crack in their emotional armor, not because you manipulated anything, but because you grew, you changed, and now they're the ones watching you. Avoidants don't feel safe with pressure, but they do feel drawn to what they can't control. The second, they feel like they lost their grip on you, when they realize they no longer know how you feel or what you're thinking, that's when curiosity is born. And that curiosity is the beginning of reflection. Let them wonder. Let them ask themselves if they misjudged you. Let them sit with the silence you used to fill. When you detach with self-worth, with strength, and with calm intention, they feel the difference. And that difference doesn't scream at them. It whispers. But that whisper grows louder every day you remain grounded in your value. And before long, the person who pulled away starts looking for signs of the very connection they once feared. Because detachment, when done with quiet strength, isn't the end. It's the trigger for their curiosity and their eventual regret. Closure is not something you wait for. It's something you give yourself. And when you're dealing with an avoidant, this truth becomes even more crucial. Because the avoidant rarely gives clean endings. They withdraw. They go quiet. They leave things hanging. They avoid conversations that might expose their vulnerability. So if you're waiting for them to come back and explain, to give you answers, to offer closure, you'll be waiting forever. But here's the shifting: when you choose to stop waiting, when you decide to give yourself the closure they couldn't, you take back your power. And when you send a message that calmly communicates this choice, not to beg, not to guilt trip, but to release, that's when something inside them jolts. Imagine sending a message like, "Thanks for the good memories. I'm grateful for what we shared. I'm moving forward with peace." You didn't ask for anything. You didn't demand an explanation. You didn't throw accusations, but you closed the door, softly but firmly. And that soft closing is what stays with them. Because it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't full of emotion, it was peaceful, it was clear, and it left no room for them to play the game of silence and return whenever they feel like it. Avoidants often leave doors half open. It's their safety net. They detach emotionally, but don't quite let go. They keep you in that uncertain space where you wonder what you did wrong, what you should say, whether they'll come back. That limbo gives them control. But when you close the loop, when you say, "I'm done walking in circles," you break that pattern. You send a message, not just through your words, but through your energy, that you are no longer emotionally available for ambiguity, and that shakes them. Not because you were cold, but because you were clear. Not because you raged, but because you released. You gave yourself the ending they avoided. And in doing that, you also gave them something they rarely face: consequences. They didn't expect you to walk away without a scene. They expected confusion, lingering hope, maybe even a fight. But when you calmly step out of the emotional chaos and say, "I'm letting go for me, not to hurt you, not to manipulate you, but because I choose peace," you disrupt their pattern. You become the one who sees things for what they are and acts accordingly. And here's what makes this kind of closure so powerful: they can't argue with it. They can't call it dramatic. They can't claim you were trying to manipulate them. It was too calm, too centered, and that kind of calm isn't easy to forget. That's what sticks in their mind. That's what haunts them at 2 a.m. when they thought they moved on. The quiet finality of someone who no longer needs closure because they gave it to themselves. That's the moment you stopped waiting and they started remembering. An avoidant hides behind silence, logic, and control. They don't like feeling vulnerable. They don't like being exposed. They don't like emotions they can't manage, especially when those emotions are their own. So when you send a message that is emotionally mature, calm, and composed, when it doesn't accuse or plead or break down, it does something powerful. It becomes a mirror, a reflection. And avoidants are rarely ever forced to look in a mirror. Most people who interact with avoidance get caught in the cycle. You get hurt by the distancing, and then you respond emotionally, you react, you explain, you try to fix things, and the avoidant sits back, watching you play out the emotion they themselves are too afraid to express. This lets them stay detached, justified, even in control. But when your response stops being emotional and becomes grounded, reflective, and peaceful, it disarms them, because now you're no longer playing your role in the pattern. You're not giving them the drama they can blame. You're not giving them the chaos they expect. Instead, you become a mirror they can't escape. And that mirror shows them something they've been avoiding their whole life: the impact of their emotional distance, the weight of their silence, the pain their avoidance creates. Let's say you send a message like this: I understand now that everyone protects themselves in different ways. I don't hold anything against you. I just can't be part of something that confuses my heart. I wish you nothing but peace. Now that's not a threat. That's not an attack. That's emotional maturity. And in those words, you've subtly held up a mirror to them. You didn't accuse them of being a bad person, but you clearly stated that their behavior brought confusion to your heart. You didn't ask them to change, but you clearly chose not to be part of a situation that brings emotional instability. That kind of message says, I see you. I see what you're doing, and I'm not here to fight you, but I also won't follow you into the fog. That type of clarity is rare in the life of an avoidant, and it's uncomfortable because it forces them to look at themselves through your eyes without your words screaming at them. Just truth, just calm truth. And that's harder to ignore than anger or begging, because when you're angry, they can say you're emotional. When you're needy, they can say you're dependent. But when you're calm, they have nothing to push against. It leaves them with only one thing to reflect on themselves, and that reflection can't be unseen. It lingers, it plays back in their mind, because avoidants are not soulless or emotionless. They're just afraid of emotional chaos. But when you show them their behavior in a composed, gentle mirror, it becomes harder for them to deny it. They may not respond immediately. They may not even know how to process it at first. But deep inside, something shifts, because you didn't fight for them to see you. You gave them a chance to see themselves. That's how you get into their head without raising your voice. That's how you leave an imprint without touching them. Your emotional mirror becomes the one thing they didn't expect, a version of themselves they can't run from, not because you forced it on them, but because you showed up as a healed, grounded version of you, and nothing reflects someone's wounds more than the presence of someone who's already chosen to heal. To an avoidant, when the person they thought would fall apart doesn't, when someone they emotionally distance themselves from suddenly stops reacting, stops clinging, and starts showing signs of personal growth, it flips the entire narrative. You see, avoidants are used to one thing: emotional intensity from the other person. They know how to navigate your breakdowns. They know how to handle the guilt, the questions, the chase. They've seen it all before. But growth is foreign to them. Growth is unpredictable, and that unpredictability doesn't just confuse them, it challenges their entire belief system. Avoidants often hold the subconscious belief that closeness equals chaos, that emotions mean instability, and that attachment leads to loss of self. So when you send a message that doesn't revolve around pain or heartbreak, but instead reflects clarity, growth, and forward momentum, they're forced to see you in a new light, a light they can't control, a light they might have underestimated. Imagine you send a text that says something like, "This time apart has helped me understand what I truly want in a relationship, and more importantly, what I won't settle for. I'm not angry. I'm just evolving." That sentence right there, calm, assertive, grounded in self-worth, is not what they expect. That message doesn't come from someone desperate to rekindle things. It comes from someone who used the distance to become better, stronger, and clearer. And that clarity is magnetic and intimidating because it reveals something quietly devastating to the avoidant: that you're no longer waiting for them to change. You're not hanging in the wings, hoping they'll come back around. You've graduated from the version of yourself that needed them. You're not trying to convince them of your worth anymore. You're simply living in it, and that's what causes them to pause. You're showing that your world didn't stop when they stepped away. You're showing that their silence didn't break you. It built you. And when you communicate that without ego, without trying to prove anything, but from a place of true inner growth, that's when you become unforgettable. Avoidants often retreat when things get too emotional, but they also retreat when they no longer feel needed. That's the irony. They fear being smothered, but they also struggle to feel significant unless someone depends on them. So when you stop needing them emotionally, when you begin to thrive independently, it quietly shakes the ground beneath them. It makes them realize they didn't just lose someone who cared, they lost someone who evolved. They start to ask themselves, did I misjudge them? Were they actually stronger than I thought? Who are they becoming without me? Those questions haunt more than any long emotional message ever could. You didn't try to make them regret their decision. You just focused on yourself. And that's what makes the impact. Growth isn't loud. It's visible. It's felt. It radiates through your words, your silence, your energy. When they expect you to be lost and you come back with clarity and grace, you shift from someone they once knew to someone they can't stop thinking about. You become the what if they never saw coming, not because you forced it, but because you choose yourself. And in doing that, you reframe the entire story, not as someone they left behind, but as someone they're starting to realize they were never truly ready for. Avoidants live in a world where vulnerability equals danger. To them, control is safety, emotional distance is protection, and anything that threatens that protection, like deep conversations, emotional intimacy, or someone who truly sees them, is something to retreat from. That's why they often appear cold or indifferent when in reality, they're simply overwhelmed. But what happens when you communicate not through pressure, not through confrontation, but through presence? What happens when your energy speaks louder than your words ever could? This is where emotional stillness becomes your greatest weapon. When you stop chasing, when you stop trying to explain your worth, and when you stop demanding clarity from someone who avoids their own emotions, something magical happens. You become unreadable. And for the avoidant, who's used to reading the emotional landscape to predict and protect themselves, that unreadability becomes deeply unsettling. Your silence is no longer just silence. It becomes a signal that you're no longer playing the emotional chess game they've mastered. Avoidants are often drawn to emotional patterns they understand. If you've always been expressive, reactive, open about your pain, they come to expect that from you. It gives them control. It lets them prepare. But when that emotional feedback loop ends, when you no longer give them that energy, they begin to feel the loss, not of chaos, but of connection. And that loss doesn't scream, it echoes quietly, constantly. You're not ghosting them. You're not playing games. You're not seeking revenge. You're just calm. And that calm becomes a mystery they can't solve, because calm doesn't beg, calm doesn't chase, calm doesn't wait. Calm moves on. And for someone who fears losing themselves in another person, the realization that you have found yourself and no longer need them hits in a way they're not prepared for. That's when they start checking your profile at 2 a.m. That's when they hover over the text field, unsure what to say. That's when they replay old conversations, trying to understand where your shift happened, because now they can't feel you, and not being able to feel you, that terrifies them more than any fight ever could. When you speak with stillness, when your energy no longer reacts but simply radiates groundedness, you communicate everything they didn't expect. You say, I see you, but I won't chase you. You say, I cared, but I care about myself more. You say, I loved, but I've healed, and that kind of energy doesn't leave easily. It sticks. It lingers in their thoughts, because now you represent what they deeply crave but fear the most. Emotional stability, self-worth, and unconditional peace. That's why the avoidant doesn't forget you, not because you forced them to remember, but because you left an emotional imprint they didn't know how to categorize. You didn't scream, you didn't plead, you didn't demand closure. You simply became untouchable. And in the stillness of your presence, you mirrored the one thing they've been running from their entire life: truth. Truth that you were always more than enough. Truth that love isn't chaos, it's clarity. Truth that the one who walks away with grace is always remembered more than the one who stayed in confusion. In your calm, you said it all, without saying a word. So many people believe that in order to be remembered, they must scream louder, try harder, or emotionally break down in front of someone who's pulling away. But what truly echoes in the heart of an avoidant isn't the noise. It's the absence. It's the unexpected calm. It's the quiet, confident release that says, I don't need to be chosen to know my worth. That is the energy that lingers. That is the message that haunts. Because they never expected the one they distanced themselves from to be the one who found peace without them. When you send that one clear, emotionally intelligent message, not to beg, not to provoke, but to liberate yourself, you end the cycle. You stop allowing yourself to be the emotional cushion for someone who hasn't yet learned how to face their own feelings. And ironically, it's in that very act of stepping away with grace that the avoidant begins to reflect, not out of guilt, not out of fear, but because for the first time, they're faced with a version of you that doesn't need fixing, doesn't need chasing, and doesn't need their validation. You showed them strength without force. That's unforgettable. Your silence, your detachment, and your emotional growth are not punishments. They're messages. Messages that say you have healed past the need for external clarity. Messages that say you can love without losing yourself. And more than anything, messages that say you are no longer willing to stay small just to fit inside someone else's comfort zone. That is a new language, one avoidants don't understand at first, but they feel it, and they don't forget it. You didn't abandon them, you elevated yourself. And that's the kind of departure that leaves an imprint on the soul. Remember, the goal was never to make them chase you, to manipulate a reaction, or to get the upper hand. The goal was to return home to yourself, to stop bleeding for someone who won't acknowledge the wound, to stop handing your emotional power to someone who treats love like a threat. You rose, quietly. And when you did, the one who couldn't handle your closeness became the one haunted by your distance. Not because of games, but because of growth. Because peace always speaks louder than pressure. So if you've sent that message, if you've chosen detachment, if you've walked away without theatrics and let your stillness speak, trust it. That energy does more than you'll ever see on the surface. It breaks through walls, it reaches through silence, and it stays long after words are forgotten. The text that haunts an avoidant is not a paragraph of pain. It's a reflection of power, your power. The kind they didn't expect, the kind they may never admit shook them. But trust this, it did. Thank you for taking the time to be here, to listen, and most importantly, to grow. Every step you take toward healing, every moment you choose clarity over chaos, you're reclaiming your power. This journey isn't easy, especially when your heart still remembers someone who couldn't meet you where you were. But know this, choosing yourself is never a loss. It's the beginning of everything. If this message resonated with you, you're not alone. You're not crazy for feeling deeply. You're not weak for wanting love to be mutual, safe, and honest. And if you've found the strength to walk away in peace instead of pain, then you've already won. Stay strong, stay grounded, and never forget your worth doesn't decrease just because someone else couldn't see it. Keep walking in your truth, because the right people won't run from it, they'll rise to meet it. Until next time, take care of your heart, protect your energy, and remember, silence isn't empty. It's full of answers. Goodbye for now, and thank you for being part of this space. You're powerful, and your story is still being written.